Hello, can everyone hear me? John and Tiffany, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm just doing a quick test. This is our first time using GoToWebinar for those of you that have joined up already and have joined a BFW webinar in the past. You'll know that we are now using new software, so bear with us as we try it out today. I think you'll see it as an improvement though, we hope. My name's Lisa Erdely. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for English at Bedford Freeman & Worth Publishers, and I'm listed there under staff as High School Marketing Organizer. So if you have any questions or you would like to chat me directly, please feel free to do that. You'll also see another person with the same name listed just under me. That is my colleague, Tiffany Tang, in our marketing department. Either of us can field any questions that you have and make sure they get to John. You can also send the questions directly to John or to the whole group. So any of those ways is just fine. I believe you can raise your hand if you click on the attendees and you find your name to ask a question, or you could just submit it through the chat. Either one is totally fine with us. I'm sorry. And you can also submit through the questions tab that's there just below attendees, and you can ask privately or send to everyone. So please feel free to do that. We also are recording today, so if you have colleagues that can't make it, just let them know that we'll be posting the webinar tomorrow, and you can revisit this, at any point that you'd like to, because we will record the whole thing. I would like to welcome everyone and thank everyone for joining us today at just after 5 o'clock on the East Coast. I am delighted that John was able to join us. John is on Portland time, so it's a little earlier there. And I know we have some West Coast friends joining us as well. We're trying this time slot. We hope it works for everyone. But, if not, let us know and give us feedback, and we'll try to shift things so that we can accommodate all of our teachers. I'm going to turn things over just shortly to John Golden. John is the author of a few textbooks with Bedford Freeman & Worth, so many of you may know John. He's currently on a special assignment with his district as a freshman success TOSA. He's been recently an English teacher and an instructional specialist at Cleveland High School in Portland, Oregon. John's also been an advisor to the College Board for many years for the 6 through 12 English Language Arts Development Committee. I mentioned he was in the classroom for a long time. So for about 20 years, John developed curriculum and led workshops and taught. He's done workshops for College Board's Pacesetter and Springboard programs, been involved with Pre-AP. He's also the author of a number of NCTE publications, mostly covering topics on teaching with documentary film, which I highly recommend checking out. And he's also the producer of our very own professional development resource, Teaching Ideas, which is for both AP Literature and AP Language. And then most recently, we wouldn't let John get away. We brought him on board a couple years ago to write and create our pre-AP materials that lead into our AP Literature and AP Language textbooks. And with the publications of Foundations of Language and Literature just this past year, we've completed our full 9 through 12 set. I'll say this again at the end. If anyone would like to obtain copies of the book or learn anything more about the resources, please do reach out to me and I'll be happy to get them over to you. And then without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John to talk to you all about differentiation and providing rigorous instruction for all students using Foundations of Language and Literature and Advanced Language and Literature. Thanks for being here, John.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. Lisa, that looks good, right? Screen-wise?
Yes, you are all set. Looks perfect.
Excellent. So there's my email there, and I'll put it back up there at the end if we want to talk a little further about anything. But the plan for the afternoon is first just to talk a little bit about differentiation just as it is, and I'm just going to cop to it right now. Everything I'm going to talk about differentiation I stole from Carol Ann Thompson. I'll try to give her credit, but I have stolen it and thieved it. So talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about equity in pre-AP. I think that especially when we're talking about 9th and 10th graders, it's way, way too early to start setting courses for students where they're going to go. So we'll talk about equity and why differentiation is so important at that particular level. And then we'll just spend time talking about the structures of these two books that Lisa talked about, specifically how they're designed really in their DNA to support differentiation. I'll talk about the opening chapters, the other chapters, some visuals, question types. And if we get time, sort of toward the end, I'll share with you a little bit about the differentiation action last year with a student that I was working with, and then hopefully some time for Q&A and wrap up. So that's kind of the plan. This is my school, Cleveland High School. As Lisa said, I'm released this year to work district-wide around what we're calling freshman success, recognizing that the graduation rate's actually tied really, really closely to how students do in their freshman year. So we're trying to put a real premium on that. So I'm getting to meet with teachers around the district to support that work. But my school itself, and I like to say this up front just so you sort of know my context and where I'm coming from. And this school was the school where I was trying out all the things found within these two books that we're going to talk about. So it's a public school, about 1,700 students. About a third of our students are free and reduced lunch. Like all of Portland, we're pretty darn white, you can see. And then other sorts of percentages there. But what's unique about Cleveland is we actually have 15 different languages spoken. We have a small population of students who are learning English as a second language, but we have a lot of different languages, with Korean, Spanish, and Arabic as our top three. Here's an important piece, just so you understand sort of my context and where it's coming from, is that all of our 9th and 10th grade English classes are untracked. So I have honor students, non-honor students, regular students, however you want to call them, all together. But we do have an honors option that students can earn honors credit in my regular 9th and 10th grade classes I can tell about. And I'll mention a couple of things as we go, and we can talk about it toward the end. But I think it's an important context just for you to understand in terms of what I'm presenting here. There's our class size. We work really hard to try to keep the freshman class sizes small. And probably like a lot of your schools too, they tend to explode the larger as you go up in the grade levels. And I already said that this year I'm working at the central office, which is its own thing that I don't want to get into at all here. But anyway, so that's kind of the plan. We're going to talk about these two books. I'll refer to it sometimes FLL or Foundations. That's the grade 9 book there. And then there's the Advanced Language and Literature book, grade 10. And you can see that it goes from a sprout to big old tree, I guess is the idea of the cover art there. So differentiation. You know, I think about differentiation this way. I really think about as being choice and specific teacher choice. And it really comes down to this idea that I feel that this is the biggest challenge that I face as a 9th and 10th grade teacher. The range of experience and knowledge and skill level is so broad in my 9th and 10th grade classes that we have to differentiate. And I think that these two texts really try to help us differentiate in these ways, these three main ways. One is through content, which for English teachers generally means the text, like the text that we're actually choosing to have our students work with. Task, in other words, what are they going to do in that? We can vary that. And the process, the how, right? These three, the content, task, and process, really makes up for me sort of the heart of what we mean for differentiation. We're also recognizing that differentiation is also about the learning environment that we create. What does the environment look like? How welcoming, how student responsive is that? And affect, our relationships with students. That's a form of differentiation. It's an essential one. All of these, especially those first three, really do come from Carol Ann Tomlinson. Again, I've stolen it that way. This is all really about choices that we, as a classroom teacher, get to make. I get to help make those choices of text, task, and process. Those are my choices. But I also don't want to leave out, when we're talking about differentiation, the importance of student choice. There's a text, ASCD text called Learning Choose, Choosing to Learn, Mike Anderson, and he just writes this, you can see it on the screen there, but it's about how we try to place students into the right area so that they're essentially in that zone of proximal development, right? The place that is just beyond their grasp, right there, to be able to have them work. And what Mike Anderson says is that he says that students, when they're in this zone, that they know their own abilities better than teachers ever can and want to be engaged in appropriately challenging work. And I absolutely agree with that. I think that we tend to think that students want to take the easy way out of things, and yeah, you'll get an occasional student like that, but I just haven't found that to be true. So Mike Anderson claims that students themselves will self-differentiate when conditions are right, And these conditions, safe environment, true sense of ownership of the work, and an understanding of themselves as learners are the focus of effective differentiation. So those two sort of components, teacher choice in terms of text, task, and process, and the importance of student choice, I think make up at least what I want to share this afternoon about differentiation. But I also want to make this really clear, is that total differentiation is impossible. And I think Lisa said that I've been teaching for about 25 years. And it seems like every year, every other year, I get a presentation, a professional development on differentiation that just always makes me feel bad. Like I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing the right things. And I just think that we have to recognize that total differentiation is impossible. We can't do it all the time for every student, for every single lesson. And this is what gets me, right? When I get observed by my administrator and the administrator says, you didn't differentiate. And I'm like, well, that wasn't what today was, right? If we talk about over the course of a unit, I'll tell you where I differentiate for all of my students in different ways, but maybe you didn't see it this one day where you needed to check off that box. I think that's the piece that somehow sometimes these things are just made to make us feel bad as teachers. But so if we know our learning targets though, and we know the most important parts of the text that we're teaching, and we're willing to make choices at appropriate high leverage opportunities. In other words, to my administrator, it wasn't today, but I swear it was yesterday, it'll be tomorrow. But at those high leverage opportunities, we can find ways for all of our students to improve their skills and knowledge. Because here's the thing, we know that all students are on a trajectory toward proficiency. Every student is. We have to figure out where they currently are and start moving them upward so they can move forward. So all students are. So I guess I want to sort of preface all of that yes, differentiation is all about teacher and student choice, but complete differentiation every day, all lessons is impossible. And we have to recognize that and understand that. Before we dive into the books a little bit, I do want to just pause for a second just to think a little bit about equity and pre-AP. For those people who are familiar with the College Board and their AP courses, probably know that several years ago, the College Board said, you know what, we're not going to have any tracks, no barriers. Schools open up your AP classes to students to try to have as broad a representation in your AP class as possible, which I absolutely am in favor of 100%. But the problem was that it's one thing to open up the doors to an AP class, but if you haven't done the work before they go into those AP classes, you're not doing any of those students or those teachers any kind of favor. So I appreciate that recently the College Board actually revised its own equity and access policy to include this last statement here, which says that the College Board also believes that all students should have access to academically challenging coursework before they enroll in AP classes, which can prepare them for AP success. It's only through a commitment to equitable preparation that true equity and excellence can be achieved. So equity isn't just about access, it's about preparation. And that is really what we tried to do here with these textbooks, is that we believe strongly to have access, you have to have equity of preparation. And so we try to support and challenge all students through engaging texts and activities, giving them that earned confidence in all the skills that we need so that they're on track for success in both AP classes in the future. So the idea is really to try to identify sort of what is it that AP does in the 11th and 12th grade, and to start sort of working backwards. Some of you may be familiar with the two courses. One of the courses often taught at the 11th grade is the AP Language and Composition course, which essentially is a course in rhetoric, a lot of nonfiction, reading and writing arguments, and the AP Literature course, which is closer to a 200 level lit course, really a survey literary analysis course. Those are the two courses that we tried to then sort of back map toward, because we know that there are overlaps between the two courses in terms of skills. The language has certain things that are unique to itself in terms of elements of rhetoric, and literature has some that are unique, but there's that huge place that overlaps. And then there's a whole nother place that overlaps that we can grab as sort of pre-AP. We don't have to do everything that the AP classes do in pre-AP, nor should we. There's some things that are very unique and specific to freshmen and sophomores, but we can identify what those skills are. And we tried to keep in mind these things. Access, making sure that all students feel like they can have an access point coming in at 9th and 10th grade. They're going to need a whole lot of support, and we'll talk about that all afternoon here with the support. Engagement, to make sure that these texts, these activities are meaningful, that are useful for kids, that they're actually things that they would want to discuss and talk about. Not all of them, of course, and not for all students, but we try to make sure that they're engaged in that way. That they challenge students, that we recognize that there are students who come into our 9th and 10th grade classes who are ready and chomping at the bit for a lot, and we have to make sure we're providing opportunities for them, all of which obviously is differentiation. And then trying to keep in mind that these are 14 and 15-year-olds we're talking about, with all the good and the challenging parts that goes to. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this at all, but I just want to throw this up here, just that the AP courses, while they're not all about the exam, there are certain components that happen in the exam that make up sort of what the course is about. And I just really briefly want to throw these out, that in the AP language exam, students are expected to write a synthesis of their own argument. They're expected to be able to do a rhetorical analysis of a nonfiction text, and they're expected to be able to write their own argument on demand according to a given prompt. For the lit course, they have to analyze a poem. They have to be able to analyze a piece of prose fiction or drama, and they need to be able to get a theme. And again, I'm putting these up here only so we can kind of see that these skills are really, really tricky, hard, difficult, complex skills. So if we're expecting that all students get there, then we have to make sure we're differentiating and get there. So we just kept asking ourselves, in order to be successful at that up above, what are students going to need to be able to do 1 and 2 years from now? Those were sort of our questions. And again, trying to reclaim that space, that pre-AP space, some stuff that's absolutely unique to 9th and 10th graders, and that which overlaps with the 2 AP courses. So I just want to pause here for just a second, Lisa, to see if maybe there are any questions that have come up about sort of how I'm defining differentiation or anything in terms of this equity piece before we really dive into the structure of the books.
There are some questions. Can you hear me okay, John?
I can, yep.
Okay, great. There's a question, how closely do these pre-AP texts align to the new upcoming changes to the AP English Literature assessment?
Yeah, we're working really closely with the new AP frameworks, which are still somewhat in development, and they're still changing. What we're working really closely with the College Board and what we're learning from that. So I don't see any big gap alignment or gap problems with this. Is that? And you could probably fill in even more than that, Lisa.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I was gonna actually chime in here. So for everyone on the call, a lot of you actually also use our AP material, so I'll just kind of talk about everything generally, which is we're tracking all of the course changes. As many of you know, with colleagues in other courses as well, all the courses are changing. We have an AP updates page, which I'll send out in the chat so that you guys have that and you can bookmark that. As resources are available, as we are making updates, changing correlations or providing documentation for adopters, we would put all of that information up on our AP updates site. So you would either be able to download it directly from there or request access to it or request access to a sample of it. So I'll paste that link as soon as I'm done talking, but anytime that there is any kind of, kind of crosswalk document or anything, any additional addendums or things that we would need to include, whether it's for assessment or just planning your course, we would distribute to teachers and adopters through that AP update site. So as we're learning, we're updating. I hope that answers that question. If you want more clarification on that after I send out the AP update site, just let me know. I'll put my email address as well in the question in the chat. I don't see any other questions at this time though, John. So if you want to continue with the presentation, I'll just put that link up now.
Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to do for just a little bit of time then is to talk about two parts of the book. One are the opening chapters of both of the books, which follow a particular structure and purpose, and then to talk a little bit about the the rest of the chapters, thematic chapters. And then what I'm hoping to be able to do is sort of give sort of an overview of these, really for the point of looking to see how the differentiation component is just sort of hard baked right into its DNA. So I hope you'll see it, but then I'll sort of reinforce it, or like what my students say, repeat myself over and over and over again. So the opening chapters of both FLL and ALL really are designed to try to identify and have students practice with the most important skills and knowledge they need to encounter for the rest of the book. And these ideas here are tied definitely to the College Board framework, Common Core state standards, however you want to do that. But most importantly, what I'm hoping that you're going to see is that they have a built-in structure to build on each other. So, and I'll go through these in a little bit more, but grades 9 and 10 each have 4 opening chapters that are very sort of narrowed, skill focused. So let me go through each one of these sort of individually. So for grade 9, for freshmen, we start with speaking, listening. This is how I start my freshmen. They have to talk to each other. They have to listen. This is so important to building community, but it's also important for them to understand that they have a voice. They have a voice that matters. And other people's voice matters. So we spent a lot of time working on exercises with how to listen to each other, how to actively listen to each other, how to ask questions, how to have meaningful dialogue and conversation so they're not arguments. And throughout it, they have opportunities to practice and share, and it culminates in a final presentation for them about a community that they're a part of. Chapter 2 is about writing. And it sort of continues from the speaking voice into the writing voice. And the idea here is that students have a writing voice that comes out through their own experiences, their backgrounds, their own histories, their own interests. All of that impacts their voice, and it gets produced through some means. And so what we do is that we sort of build up through. We start really at the basic level of diction, just focusing on words and word choice. Then we teach students how to build sentences that have some level of complexity for them, and we name them. We actually name what types of sentences they're working with. And then we build up to a paragraph. And this is debatable and certainly worthy of discussion, but we decided that's where it ends for the freshmen at the beginning of the year. I spend the first semester just working with my freshmen on just getting a good, solid paragraph. Second semester, we build into essays, but I think that for me, in my experience, sometimes going too fast gets students sort of lost. So I get much better essays second semester when I've taken the time to really slow down and teach them how to build really effective paragraphs. Chapter 3 is about reading, and it's about recognizing that we don't read texts all in the same way for the same purposes. Sometimes we read for understanding, sometimes we read to draw interpretations, and sometimes we read for style and craft. So helping students to recognize that you read differently, you have different terminology that you're looking for, and you respond to those different reading purposes differently. And the last chapter in the 9th grade is about using sources. And this is very much of an introduction for why would you even want to use a source? What makes a good source? How are you going to use that source into your own writing? We break it down into very basic level of literally like where the comma goes, where the quotation mark goes, where the parenthetical notations go. So the idea of this, and I hope you see it, it's foundational. It really does try to begin at or near the beginning. The 10th grade, we start with this notion, and this actually just comes from a student that I had a couple of years ago who said, Mr. Golden, why do we study English every year? And so we start with that. What does it mean to be a reader of the world, and why do we analyze things, and how is it really not that different than what you do in your science classes in terms of looking for evidence, drawing interpretation or conclusions, supporting that with evidence. Chapter 2 gets more specific into reading literature and how to draw interpretations and how to analyze for style. Chapter 3 is all about argument. All the components that go into writing and reading an argument, such as claim, appeals, evidence, and style. And chapter 4, like chapter 4 in the 9th grade book, is about really using sources. In this case, we're calling it synthesis, though. We take students from working from a single source into multiple sources, and then being able to write their own informed argument based upon those. The idea of these opening chapters is that I feel like they begin at the beginning, and I put that in quotes because, I mean, what does that really mean? But what we try to do is to make as few assumptions as possible about the skills and knowledge that they've brought with them. We really do try to begin at or near that beginning. And all of these terms, what we find is that students struggle in ninth grade in particular, and 10th grade as they go, because they don't have the academic vocabulary to access the content or what the teacher's asking for. So key academic terms like such as theme or annotate or rhetoric or synthesis, we define, we practice, and we work with, so that the assumptions that we often make about what students bring, we try to reduce those. Throughout the opening chapters, they're just short, tiny passages to practice with. Some are as a couple of sentences. Some might be as long as a few paragraphs. But what I like especially is that within each of these opening chapters, I have several formative assessment opportunities where all along the way I can check to see, do my students really know how to annotate? Do my students really know how to draw an interpretation? Do they really know how to analyze for style? So at each place I can have these short little assessment opportunities, because each chapter then ends with some kind of culminating activity. We call it an activity in the book. For me, it's always an assessment at the end of each opening chapter, so I can actually really see how closely are they reading, how effectively are they able to pull these components together into an effective paragraph, for instance. And I also believe this, and again, this keeps coming back to this idea of especially teacher choice, that what we tried to do is to very clearly identify where the stuff is getting hard, like where they are entering into that zone of proximal development, and where things might be harder. Now, and I think that you do this, for instance, and I put these in just as a couple examples. I've had classes where when I'm reading a text with them, a literary text, I will only get them to theme. They're not quite ready for what I think is much more complex, which is tone. So we'll stop. We'll stop at theme, we'll keep practicing with theme, and then I'll know that we'll come back to tone a little bit later. So these opening chapters build in that level of complexity that you as a teacher can say, you know what, we're going to end at the sentence here for this group or for this class, or maybe even for these students. The rest are going to move on maybe to the paragraph. So what we tried to do is to see that these skills that students acquire build on each other. The great thing is that in our discipline, all these things are recursive. Can you imagine being a math teacher? You can't just skip, the Pythagorean theorem and expect them to go. We can, because we know that ours are recursive. We can loop back and bring it back. Do you think that the only time the kids are going to encounter tone is in the ninth grade? So again, reason number 285 why we're probably English teachers, not math teachers. So I want to pause for just a second there, if we can, Lisa, just to see if there are any questions about sort of the opening chapters. My next section is going to be about the structure of the actual chapters themselves, but I just want to pause for a second to see if there are any questions that have come up.
I'm just going to check both sections. There's questions and chat. So I do see one. Nope. This is a question for me, just about how to get access. Nothing for you right now about the text, John.
Beautiful. So the other chapters in this text, they work this way. In ninth grade for foundations, it's organized by genre or mode. And we made this choice specifically because we felt that ninth graders need to have sort of a really solid grounding and understanding of the multiple kinds of texts that they're going to encounter. We know that throughout the rest of their high school career, they're going to be reading poetry, drama, expository, fiction, etc. That ninth grade might be the year to make sure that we're locking in what are those essential elements for each of those genres and modes. Whereas the 10th grade book probably looks maybe a little bit more familiar. It's certainly modeled a little closer to the AP books that Bedford publishes, but it's organized thematically. And this was organized thematically most really to make it most relevant to the AP course they're going to encounter. And I believe too that it gives them these multiple opportunities for synthesis. In other words, you're looking at text sort of in common. And I think this might make a little bit more sense when we look at some of the structures of the book on the next pages. But those are the, and I'll go through these a little bit more, but you can see that in the 9th grade, those are the genres and modes that we focus on: fiction, argument, poetry, exposition, narrative, drama, and mythology. And in the advanced book, in the 10th grade book, they are themes. So these are identity and society, ambition, restraint, ethics, culture and conflict, miscommunication, and utopia, dystopia. And so those chapters in the 10th grade book are made up of all of those genres and modes that exist on the left-hand side there in the foundation. So our sort of proposal really was that when students have a better grounding and understanding in how to read a poem, when they're reading that poem as part of a theme in the ethics chapter, they can do more with it. Is sort of our assumption in that way. So what I want to do is I want to break down what a chapter in the 9th grade foundations looks like. And I want to do it because what I'm hoping you're going to see is how the differentiation is really just sort of hard packed into the structure of it. Hope you can see that on your screen. On the left-hand side is just a screenshot of a table of contents from one of the chapters. In this case, this is a chapter on argument. And so each chapter starts with the first workshop, which introduces students to the essential elements of that genre or mode with a really short, easily accessible anchor text. So for instance, for argument, making sure students understand what the rhetorical situation means, what evidence means, what a claim and counter argument look like, rhetorical appeals, etc. So to understand the essential elements of that. This would be true for poetry. Are they in the essential elements? They have to understand speaker, they have to understand figurative language, etc. Same thing for exposition and the rest. Then what happens, and you can see they're labeled argument section 1, section 2, and then down below section 3. These are sections of texts with ascending levels of text complexity. So the text found there in section number 1, these really are texts that students can probably access with a minimal amount of either teacher support or additional contextual information. For instance, the first one in there is why school should start later in the day. Kids don't need a lot of context, right, in that particular one to understand that. They tend to be shorter. They tend to be a little easier to access in that way. And then they get more complex as they go. Section 2 really are texts that are probably grade level and just above grade level in that way. And section 3 texts are texts that, quite frankly, probably wouldn't be out of place in an actual AP class. Mark Twain is in there, for instance. A speech by Cesar Chavez is in there. So some really complex, this might be because of time period, might be because of language in the case of Mark Twain, might be in terms of background knowledge and context students need. Those texts obviously are ones that that students will probably need much more teacher support or additional contextual information. Each text always has a central text. It's really sort of a representation of that particular mode. In this particular case, it's an argument by Peggy Orenstein called "What's Wrong with Cinderella?" Really sort of arguing about gender roles. And there's always a conversation of text, almost always nonfiction, really short texts. Some cases these are, a page, page and a half or so. Really, usually easy access, but they're all sort of related to a particular idea. In this case, it's about the media shaping our ideas of gender roles, and it leads students toward being able to write their own really short synthesis argument. Workshop 2 is about writing in the genre and mode. I think most people recognize that the best way to understand how an argument works is to write an argument. That also goes for the literary pieces too. The best way to understand a poem is to actually try to construct a poem or a piece of drama. And then the last workshop really is about analyzing a text within that genre or mode. So this is where, in this particular case in the argument, students would write their first real rhetorical analysis. So the idea, that's sort of a chapter at a glance, and it has each of these components. Hoping those components are going to make sense when we talk about the sort of differentiation that's already happening within there. I think you'll probably see. Let me go through this just real quickly here. This was my narrative unit that I did. And we took just one period. I'm on the block period, so 78, 79-minute periods. We started up with workshop one, took me one class period to do. And then as a class, we read two pieces. We read one piece that came from section one, a great narrative called By Any Other Name. And then we also read the central text, La Granguita by Julia Alvarez. And those were the only two texts that we read together as a class, where I led them through that. Because then what students did is that they chose three additional narratives that they would want to read on their own. And what I did, and I told you about this at the very beginning, I don't have a separate honors class, but I do have an honors option for students. So for students who want to contract with me for honors credit, I ask them to challenge themselves and to read texts from this third section. And I was shocked at how many kids loved to read the Murakami piece that's in here. It's so hard, but they loved reading it because it was about running. Kind of, sort of. It's Murakami, so it's also about a whole bunch of other things. But the idea was, though, that kids chose from there based upon their own interest, in some cases their desire for honors credit, in some cases for where they were sort of in their own ability or interest in reading narratives. I asked students to read a minimum of two texts from that conversation, and we'll talk about that conversation in just a little bit. There are 5 texts to choose from. I asked them to read at least 2. I had some students that only read 1, that's fine, and I had a whole bunch of students who read all 5. Workshop 2, the students drafted their own narratives, and then workshop 3, where students then took one of the 3 narratives that they read on their own, and they wrote an analysis of that one. And I modeled sort of the writing of that analysis based upon Julia Alvarez's La Granguita, which we all looked at. So I think you're probably already seeing how that unit itself sort of has some differentiation in it, but I'll talk about it a little bit more when we kind of sum up this section. But I just wanted you to sort of see how a unit sort of plays out and it actually works. So this was that conversation, and the conversation in the narrative unit was about what's the relationship between language and power. And they read a number of texts, Jimmy Santiago Baca, Richard Wright, for instance. And again, I had them choose at least 2. Again, many wrote more. And then they got to choose one of these 3 prompts. And I'm just going to put these up here for a second because I want you to see that these prompts themselves are leveled. Everyone's writing an argument, but some students, for instance, with prompt 1, they're really at this point, really to talk about this argument, this concept of language and power. At this point, they're really most prepared to talk about it in their own personal context, right? Now, they still have to refer to Jimmy Santiago Baca or Jessica Wolf as they're responding to this, but they're doing it through themselves. Prompt 2 is really more of a straight up argument that students can take a side for, right? And then prompt 3 is much more abstract. It's much more, they're going to draw on not just the works there, but they're really going to draw on sort of society's thinking as a whole. Each one of these conversations have these leveled prompts where students themselves either choose or a little nudge from me in terms of which one. The great thing is, and I think that you're seeing this obviously, is that all students are writing an argument. All students are using sources to write that argument. The only thing that's changing is the prompt that I'm using to get there. I could score all of my students with the exact same rubric, regardless of the prompt that they chose or the text that they chose. You know, Lisa, I think I'm going to skip over this, and then they'll have this availability to the PowerPoint, I'm sure, afterwards. But I do think that this book can also, it doesn't, just because my class is I have both levels or all levels of students in my class, doesn't mean that you can't use it in different ways in different contexts. But I think for our purposes now, I think I'll just move on real quick to the way that thematic chapters are constructed in the grade 10 text. And again, this is thematic. It's not genre mode like the 9th grade one. These are thematic. And this is a chapter on identity and society. And I always did this at the beginning of the year because it's really closest to sort of a coming of age kind of chapter. It's about changes and transformations. And then each chapter starts with essential questions. Always has a central text. In this case, this is George Orwell, Shooting an Elephant. It has a conversation of text that we sort of called literature leaning. In other words, it has more literature in it than anything else. It has a whole bunch of other genres and modes in there, but you can see that there's fiction, there's poetry, there's drama in there. Second conversation is sort of an AP Lang leaning conversation. In other words, this is more nonfiction. You can see several nonfiction pieces in there, memoir or expository. And then each chapter also has these very short skill workshops, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but these are, in fact, the reading workshops can be done in a single class period where it's a really narrowed sort of focus on a particular skill that students need. So I just want to highlight just for a second, here's one of the conversations. This is the sort of literature leaning side. This is about changes and transformations. You can see the texts that are listed there for students to be able to choose from. And then they make some connections. In other words, they're trying to draw a connection between John Krakauer and his narrative of climbing a mountain in Alaska with James Joyce's Eveline. And what does that mean to face sort of difficult decisions in that way? So connecting multiple texts is a skill that sophomores are ready and need to start working more on. The other text, other conversation in that same chapter is one on the individual in school. And these are texts that focus on really how it is that the individual sort of butts up in some cases with the institution. Sometimes the institution is supportive and sometimes not. In this case, students have the opportunity to synthesize sources. John Taylor Gatto, for instance, one of the writers in here, sort of suggests that we don't even need high school anymore, which is kind of dangerous to give to sophomores. But he says, we shouldn't even have it anymore. So what does that mean? What would school look like if people didn't go to school? I mean, what would learning look like? So they can draw on multiple sources from that conversation to create those. So I just wanted to give you those sort of as an overview of the 9th and 10th grade structure. So really, so we can talk about this, which is that in 9th grade, the most important and the most useful tool for me is that I have text sets of increasing levels of complexity. Not all of my students read the same text. We're in the same genre and mode, but not all my students are reading the same text. What they do is that they might read individually, and then I'll put them into groups, maybe based upon text that they chose, but not all students need to. You saw that in those entering conversation questions that there are 3 sort of different levels of prompts with increasing difficulty and abstractness. I found actually that when students really know sort of their own level in this way, they almost always gravitate to a prompt that they feel like they can actually do in challenging themselves with that. Said this a lot, so I put it in red. Let students choose. They do need guidance sometimes. Sometimes they need suggestions. Sometimes they need little nudges in some cases. Hey, I think you can do better with that. I think you should go in this one. There are what we call vocabulary and context questions. Some students need to sort of increase their word awareness. We know that there's a real gap in vocabulary for students. So these are opportunities for them to look at words within the context of the text. Some students need these, some don't. And grammar, probably the single most important place for us to differentiate as English teachers. We know that not all of our students need help in, run-on sentences. Half of my students do. Those students, I can have them do this particular grammar lesson that exists in the back of the book, but why would I ask a student who's never committed a run-on in any of the work that they've submitted to do that same grammar lesson? Rather, I would work for a different skill that they would have, that they're deficient in. So grammar is so important for us to differentiate because it would be based on the actual errors that they're committing. And that's what the grammar lessons in the 9th grade book really get at, is that it tries to get at the errors that they're committing through their own writing, and to reflect on their own writing, and to go back and forth between this opportunity to practice and the rest. There's nothing worse than a student sort of suffering through a grammar lesson that they don't need, except for capitalization. I think they all need capitalization these days. I don't know, it's the texting, I guess. In the ALL in grade 10, again, varying levels of text complexity within a conversation. Now, what's different is that they are not included as text sets in the rest, like they are for the ninth grade. So I just want to skip through real quick just to show you sort of what I mean. Is that here's that conversation we talked about the individual in school. And if you just look at that, some of those texts are really, really, there's Horace Mann in there. He's writing, for a very literate audience in the early 19th century. And so in the teacher's edition, we identify places where Friends with Boys, for instance, is an easier text complexity. It's a graphic novel. It's super engaging for students. And there's Horace Mann. We try to describe sort of what makes certain texts more challenging than the others. It's not as explicit with the ninth grade in terms of putting it in text sets, but it's absolutely still there for you and students to make choices. There are always a range of topics for composing after each central text that are adaptable to student needs and levels. And what we do is identify in the teacher's edition, this is a hard one, this is an easier one, this would be one to push. And then suggestions in the teacher's edition to address contextual interpretive challenges. Sometimes the only thing that students need in order to access a text is just a little bit of opportunity to try to get a little bit more background. So this can make a difference between a student sort of reading at a grade level text or a challenging text sometimes. And I talked about this briefly. There are these really short standalone reading workshops that target specific student needs. And I regularly assign these to individual students. Hey, I've realized that you're kind of still struggling a little bit with this concept we talked about in the opening chapter of tone. Here's just a little workshop that you can work through. It'll take you one class period to do, and it'll help you to get there. So again, the idea of identifying what it is that students need, and here's a tool or resource to get you there. I think that might be just another quick place for me to pause, Lisa, if we can. Again, just to see if there are questions about things I said here. The last part that I want to talk about really are just some of the sort of other features that are sort of hardwired in. But these are sort of the structural pieces that I want to maybe see if there are questions about.
So far, no questions about that. Again, just questions directly to me about other items that I can handle, but nothing about what you're going through, John.
Beautiful. I'm going to choose to assume that that means everything is going great, and it's not that everyone is asleep on the webinar. It's my choice. I'm making that choice for me. So I'm going to go on. All right, so we did this already. The other features of differentiation that are sort of just real key components of these books, visual texts, varied question types, and additional tools, some of which I talked about briefly, but I'll talk about a little bit more. Dr. Edwin Ellis has done some work specifically with like graphic organizers and differentiation and sort of multiple learning approaches. And he says the use of visual prompts are among the most powerful tools teachers can employ to facilitate learning. Visual prompts can enable teachers and students to see how learned information is structured, as well as how to engage in complex information processing tasks. I see very little difference in the skills that students need when they're reading a visual text as opposed to a print text. Now, there are additional ones, don't get me wrong, there absolutely are. But the skills themselves of identifying, of interpreting, of looking for style, all of these are also things that we can do with visual texts. And so we do. We put a lot of visuals in these texts. And most important, however, we teach students how to read those visual texts. So it's not enough just to say, hey, look at this, what does this mean? But rather, let's look at the color and lighting in this, or let's look at how it's framed or how it's focused, the layout and the design and the fonts and symbols that are here. We need to give students the tools to read a visual text in the same way that we would give them the tools to read a print text. So we introduce how to read visual text with students, and then we give them lots of opportunities to sort of look at visual texts in comparison with each other and with print text. One of my favorite texts in the 9th grade book is one by named Steve Allman, who asked the question, is it immoral to watch the Super Bowl? Spoiler alert, he says, yes, it is. But what's interesting is that he's a former football player himself and a huge football fan, but the issues around concussions really started to sort of get to him. So the editorial is there, but then also we surround it with a variety of visual text. For instance, just a painting. look at how this painting presents the sort of an image of football that Alman would either find appropriate or inappropriate. Like, it's a highly romanticized version there of what the game of football is, right? So how would students read that visual text and then compare it to Alman? Here's a warning label that's starting to appear on football helmets. First, do you think that this would have any kind of impact? And would Alman think that this would be enough to let him watch football again? Right? Is it enough just to make sure that people understand the risks, or is Alman getting at something different? Or here's a chart. This chart looks variety of different sports and the concussions per 10,000 games. So what's happening in this chart, and what would Alman say? What would he use to sort of support, or what would you use to oppose it? So the idea is that these visual texts, as Dr. Ellis suggested, give students a variety of ways in and to engage, and we as teachers can learn a whole lot about their own analysis processes by looking at visual texts. There's also a variety of types of questions. And I'll just throw out a few here that come from Laguna Gita that we talked about earlier. There are always opportunities for students to demonstrate their understanding and interpreting. And these questions almost always get more complex as they go on. So we ask sort of real sort of general, do you have it kind of questions. Do you understand it? Can you sort of tell us, sort of paraphrase or summarize sort of what's happening? And then they start getting a little bit more complex as you go deeper into the text and into the questions. We also ask questions about language and style and structure. Oftentimes these, again, you can see the vocabulary and context questions that are there, and sometimes very specific, right? What is that metaphor of being thrown in the deep end? Like, what does that mean as far as learning a language in that way? Getting more complex. And then we have topics for composing that give students, again, and teachers a tremendous amount of choice. How do you want your students to demonstrate their knowledge of Laguna Gita and the themes found within there? You might want a literary analysis, depending upon what your needs are based on your school or district, or maybe you want them to do an argument, or maybe really what you want to find out sort of how they have internalized this theme that Alvarez is getting at, and you want them to reflect in sort of a more personal way. Again, student choice, maybe depending upon what your standards and needs are, give them the choice to demonstrate their understanding, or you get to choose based upon what you think your students need at that particular time. And then one of the things that I really appreciate about Bedford is that Bedford works really, really hard to make sure that their products are actual, like, real stuff. And one of the ways that they do it is through these teachers editions. All of the notes that I'm going to describe here in just a second are written by actual classroom teachers.
John?
Yeah, did I go away for a little bit there, Lisa?
Just right before you flipped to the regular presentation. Yes, you did.
All
Sorry about
right.
that. I hope that
Yeah.
wasn't something I clicked.
Okay. So their notes that they wrote, again, these were actual real classroom teachers. A lot of times they were doing them as we were writing the text. We're saying, hey, try this out. Can you give us some ideas on this? But their notes fall into these particular pieces that are so important for differentiation. Number one is context. These are questions or activities or additional resource pieces to make sure that students have the opportunity to engage fully with the text. This might be about giving historical or geographical or cultural background. Oftentimes, that's the differentiation piece that students need. Close reading opportunities. These are places that are really going to sort of hone in on what we call sort of the heart of the text. I oftentimes will say to a student, especially a student who's maybe an English language learner, I don't need you to read this whole text. I can paraphrase the rest for you. But this part is the heart of the matter. I really want us to focus in on that particular part. And our teachers have identified those places for us. Checks for understanding. How do you know that students are getting it? And if they don't get this particular part, like this particular understanding, like if you don't get this, understand what's happening plot-wise or theme here, you're going to be stuck, or you're going to find the rest of the place confusing. We ask the teachers to say, where are the places where your students are getting hung up? That's the place we want to ask a question or two just to see. And then last, lots and lots of teaching ideas. These are collaborative learning, maybe opportunities, or maybe do a little artwork activity or graphic organizers, things that the teachers themselves said, if I were teaching this, this is what I would have to do at this particular time to help all of my students to access the text. And I'm not going to go through these, but there are other things, other resources that are designed to try to help you to make choices. One of the things I want to highlight, just because I put in red here, is that in Foundations, what we did is that we tried to identify these places and skills that your students might be struggling with. And if they're struggling with, let's say, using evidence, you might try X, Y, Z activities on these pages, so that when you're looking and you're seeing, wow, my students are really kind of here, I might need to pause, or maybe a couple of my students might need to do this activity as opposed to the other. So we tried to identify those for you, again, to be able to make effective choices. I've got just a couple of minutes left, and I think I want to just really briefly sort of summarize how I differentiate for a student. And this is a student who tested in ELPA 2, which came from Mexico for me last year. And I just briefly want to say, what I tried to do is to hold the standards the same. When we differentiate, we don't lower the standard or change the standard. Those remain the same. So KV should still be able to determine a theme, and she absolutely should be able to analyze complex characters. But what I did for her is that oftentimes time was a factor for her. Right? It took her longer to read. It took her longer to write. If I take time out of that equation, she can demonstrate all of those standards. The length of her reading and her writing, I absolutely differentiated. I would sometimes just give her a portion of a text to read. I would shorten up the amount that I would ask her for her to do. And I always varied the text types with her. I gave her texts that were more appropriate for both her interest and for her level. The idea being is that, and Lisa's going to make this available to you. These are just some strategies that I used as I was trying to differentiate for her. Again, trying to keep the standards the same. And I got her to write some things. And I got her to write a summary to demonstrate that she can do main idea. And she was able to write an analysis of a narrative about an immigrant. And she was able to do this at a level and a rate that was appropriate for her. By using the tools over here. So I just want to kind of remind where we started, which is that total differentiation is absolutely impossible. Don't even bother and stop feeling guilty about it. You're not. And really just trying to focus in on those high leverage opportunities. I essentially made 5 sort of instructional choices with Catherine in my class. And those are high leverage opportunities where I knew that if I did this, she could be able to do this, because KV, like everyone else, is on a trajectory toward proficiency. And that's sort of where I wanted to end as well, which is to end where we started, which is that we really don't have a choice when we're talking about equity. We have to make sure that all of our students, regardless of where they went to middle school, where they are in their skill and interest level as they're coming in freshman year, we have a responsibility to make sure that by the time they leave the 10th grade, that they absolutely could be in a position to be into one of those 2 AP courses. That's Bedford's commitment. That's what the commitment is in the resources, and it's absolutely what's right for kids in our society, I think. So that's where I think I'll end. I think it's 1 minute for questions, but
I do have one, and I have one other thing I would want to share with the group too. Thank you so much, John. That was great. And when you said that the silence you were taking as a sign that things were going well, there were a lot of affirmative messages that I received that they agreed. So that's very good. Thank you, everyone, for your feedback. We really appreciate it. I did have one question earlier that I fielded myself just a bit, John, but I said that I would ask you. There was a teacher who said that he or she teaches in a very conservative district and wondered if the piece is skewed towards the more liberal side. And I talked a little bit about your process for selecting pieces, but I think you could do probably a better job than I can of addressing that question. So I wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I'll just say, yeah, so I live and teach in Portland, Oregon. So the question is well founded and well concerned for sure. A great thing about there are a lot of things that happen. One of my co-authors lives in Texas and works in Texas, and she will regularly say, John's a great text, but that's not going to fly in Texas. And that's sort of the initial part of that. And then we go through a really rigorous process for that. Do they skew liberal? God, I really, really hope not. I really hope not. But again, we're all human, we're all biased in this way. I hope not. There's so many sort of breaks and checks in place to try to avoid that. And I think that I think that it probably reveals a balance in that way. But I hope.
Yeah, and that I can actually follow up there with what I had answered to that teacher for everyone else, which is from a more global perspective. When we're developing all of our products for high school, we have advisory boards and focus groups where we actually test, with teachers in all different kinds of districts to make sure that, the table of contents looks appropriate for them. We don't want, any parent backlash or that things look diverse enough, accessible, all of those different things. So, I think our editorial staff is really, really concerned and keeps an eye to make sure that we have, selections from all different types of authors and things that are not going to get teachers in any trouble or anything like that with parents at home. The other thing I just wanted to add was that John's email is up there. His Google site is up there. My email address is, I'm going to say it out loud, but it's also in the chat. You can email me if you'd like a copy of anything. We will be sending out the recording of this, and we can also send out the PowerPoint. I'm sorry, I'm used to saying PowerPoint, the Google Slides in that email as well. And so you'll have access to that usually within 24 hours, we'll get that out. But if for some reason it goes to your spam or you don't get it, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, my information is in the chat, but it's L Erdely, Erdely, at bfwpub.com. That's B as in boy, F like Frank, W like Walter, PUB like publishers.com. And I know that's not the correct letters and names to choose, but that's okay. So just, send me an email, let me know if there's anything that you need. You can also get us at hsmarketing@bfwpub.com, and that will reach anyone on my team, and we can help you out with access to the recording or any of the slides. So thank you all for joining us today at this late hour on the East Coast. We appreciate all of your questions and feedback. And John, again, thank you for taking the time to talk with us about differentiation in the materials. We really appreciate your time. So thank you to everyone.
Yeah, thank you all.
Okay. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.